From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Friday, November 1. An Indigenous activist group that convinced Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek to block $1 million gold mine in Bali has form. The Australian is exclusively revealing the Wiradjuri Elders Group successfully opposed a Bathurst go-kart track in 2019. That story's live right now at theaustralian.com.au. An upgrade to business class has never been this uncomfortable. Anthony Albanese is seeking to reassure his ministers he's done nothing wrong and is the victim of unfair media reporting over allegations he solicited Qantas flight upgrades. And now the Coalition's transport spokeswoman is facing questions of her own. That's today's episode. If you've ever been in Canberra on a Thursday night as Parliament is rising for the week, you'll know you need to stand back as politicians stampede to the airport.
They cannot get out of here fast enough.
Rosie Lewis is The Australian's political correspondent, and we're talking about a story that's blown up in the face of Labor and, to a lesser extent, the Coalition in recent days. It's about politicians' cosy relationship with Qantas, and it's turning into one of those political scandals where you never know who's going to have their ankles bitten next.
The fallout from there has been extremely messy for the Prime Minister, and we still, 5-6 days in, have unanswered questions. More questions continue emerging.
It started on Saturday when extracts were published of a new book by Joe Aston, a former columnist with Nine Entertainment. In his book, Aston, who's a former staffer for PM John Howard and Treasurer Joe Hockey, and he also worked at Qantas in the early days of his career before becoming a journalist, he's alleged Anthony Albanese has received free upgrades from Qantas on domestic and international flights booked not for work, but for himself and his family on private travel.
The Prime Minister then held a press conference on Sunday.
From time to time, members of Parliament receive upgrades. What's important is that they are declared. All of mine have been declared.
That, in my view, answered very few questions. When the coverage continued and really only ramped up from there, the Prime Minister, I think, tried to nip it in the bud on Tuesday, but again made the problem worse with a very confused press conference.
Did you call Alan Joyce personally for these upgrades?
Look, the idea, Qantas have a number in terms of bookings that are made private bookings.
It was genuinely hard to understand what he was trying to say as to when he had or hadn't spoken to Alan Joyce, whether he had in fact solicited these flight upgrades for personal travel, particularly personal overseas travel with family members. That's at the heart of the sort of bad look for Albanese. Obviously, at some point, maybe early on or maybe later, he and his office realised that they needed to do a much better job than they had done in clarifying exactly what had gone on. So they were going back through his records, flight records over nearly 30 years of his parliamentary career in the background. And we then got a fairly late statement just before 6 o'clock on Wednesday night. It was just a couple of lines on record, and the key being that he had never called Alan Joyce. What we didn't get was clarification as to whether he had spoken with Alan Joyce in any other way, i.e. text or email. What we didn't get was clarification whether his office had spoken to anyone at Qantas or the Prime Minister had spoken to anyone at Qantas. So there was then more clarifying background on Thursday morning from his office saying there had been no other communication with Alan Joyce, and we know that the Prime Minister spoke with 2GB's Ben Fordham on Wednesday night, ruling out a heap of things that he himself had not spoken to Joyce or anyone else at Qantas asking for an upgrade.
The question was asked, did you ever text Alan Joyce about flight upgrades? The PM's answer? No. Did you ever email Alan Joyce about flight upgrades? The PM's answer again? No.
The outstanding question now is, did anyone in his office do this? Did anyone in his office ring a particular person or a particular phone number, and in doing so, were they effectively guaranteed an upgrade? The background I received on Wednesday was that many different staff members, as you'd expect, booked the Prime Minister's travel over his many years in Parliament through the normal channels, and upgrades were given in the usual way to all politicians.
So, why does it matter? Well, because Albanese was the Minister for Transport in Labor's former government. Then he was opposition transport spokesman. And Qantas is one of the country's most powerful businesses. It's a huge provider of travel to government employees, including bureaucrats and politicians. And government has a critical role in regulating Qantas and the aviation market, including any potential competitors.
The Transport Minister says the treatment of Australian women who are subjected to invasive body searches at Doha Airport was a factor in her decision to block extra Qatar Airways flights into the country. Catherine King says it was just one factor, but won't say what the others were, denying accusations that it was Qantas that influenced her decision.
And it's a tough corporate player, embroiled in workplace dramas like other big businesses.
3 former Qantas workers who were sacked during the pandemic have had a big win in the federal court.
It's possible, I suppose, Rosie, that Qantas has a system that flags when a VIP books a flight and automatically upgrades them, or just make sure that that is sorted out. If that turns out to be the case, is that the end of it? Or is that also problematic, do you think?
I think it's much less problematic, but the problem for the Prime Minister is the damage to an extent has already been done. The government has been completely off message and completely distracted by something that should have and could have been dealt with on day dot.
Coming up, how the coalition's lead attacker got drawn into the drama. Bridget McKenzie is a very colourful figure in the opposition. She's been front and centre leading the attack on Anthony Albanese.
Now, if he wants to clear his name, if he thinks he's got nothing to hide, then get out here and tell us the truth. Get it on the record. Refer yourself to the NAC.
And now she's had to admit that she herself is trying to find out whether she has ever received upgrades that she's failed to declare on the Register of Members' Interests. How did that go so wrong?
Yeah, the PM needed to get his house in order on Saturday. Bridget McKenzie needed to get her house in order on Monday before she came out and demanded that Mr Albanese release a full log of his flights. She came out and said she had never asked or received a flight upgrade, full stop, and within hours, I believe, she had to correct the record because her register showed that, in fact, she did receive an upgrade in 2018. A couple of days later, and it's now turned out she's facing questions as to whether she received more upgrades and didn't disclose them properly, which can be sort of in breach or in contempt of the Senate. Given that Bridget McKenzie and Peter Dutton are leading the attack against the Prime Minister, and given Bridget McKenzie has had to resign as a minister in the past over the sports fraught saga, you would have thought she would have been 100% certain in her own affairs before coming out in attack of the Prime Minister.
Does this whole story just speak to a culture that's saturated in receiving upgrades and effectively gifts from airlines?
I think it does. We do have codes of conduct for MPs, for ministers, that are very clear about not accepting gifts, sort of personal gain that could be in conflict with your work. But this is something that has become so widespread, not just among politicians, also among the people who work for them and other high-ranking Australians. But when you zoom out and look at it from the eye of the punter, it doesn't quite feel right or pass the pub test especially if you're soliciting something, which we know now the Prime Minister saying he personally did not.
Okay, and Rosie, what are the stakes here, just finally? If Anthony Albanese turns out to have made a mistake and forgotten that, in fact, he or someone who works for him did solicit an upgrade, or if Bridget McKenzie discovers that, yes, she also solicited upgrades and received them and failed to disclose them, what happens to each of those people? What's the most likely scenario?
I think at this point, if it turns out that Bridget McKenzie did receive upgrades, I don't think at this point there's a suggestion she solicited them, but if she received them and didn't disclose them, that does seem to be a bad look. There are colleagues in our Canberra bureau who think she will have to go as opposition transport spokeswoman. If that turns out to be true, Peter Dutton is standing by her at this stage, but she hasn't received her audit back yet. So let's wait and see. But worst case scenario for Bridget McKenzie, she has to step down from the front bench again. If Anthony Albanese turns out to have had his office solicit an upgrade, he'll have to apologise for that. And he'll have to answer endless questions from the coalition as to whether that raised a conflict. At this stage, though, his cabinet's standing beside him. There's no leadership rumblings. So I think at this point, worst case scenario for the Prime Minister is lost weeks of Parliament, lost weeks of having any sort of coherent message to the public in the lead up to an election, but probably no scalp there. Bridget McKenzie would be the more likely scalp at this stage, pending the outcome of her audit.
Rosie Lewis is The Australian's political correspondent. If there are any scalps, our subscribers at The Australian will be the first to know. Join us at theaustralian.com.au. A year's subscription is cheaper than a single business class flight from Sydney to Melbourne. And we don't have engineering issues, unexplained delays or warm Chardonnay. Thanks for joining us on The Front. Our team is Kristen Amiot, Jasper Leake, Leah Tsemaglu, Joshua Burton and Tiffany Dimmack.